Today we're going to be talking about motivational theories in sport. In our review, we wanted to find research that talked about motivational styles and which styles could be used in an athletic administration position. Our research focused on not only motivating athletes in order to help us find the best possible coaching candidates, but also how to motivate the coaches themselves to help us as athletic administrators. We believe that being able to motivate is just as important as being a quality leader. Leadership is one thing, but motivating your department to become better overall is a challenge all in itself. The goal was to compile the strongest research in this particular area of study to be able to put it to use in any field you may work in. The keywords we used, of course all these are accompanied with sport, was motivation, motivational theory, intrinsic motivation, and extrinsic motivation. The first piece of literature that we reviewed was verbal aggression in basketball, perceived coach use in athlete intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This study's purpose was to examine if verbal aggression of a coach is related to an athlete's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The study shows that internal motivation is linked to positive behaviors and external motivation is linked to negative behaviors. Of course, internal motivation is things like doing a quality job or meeting a psychological need, whereas external motivation is going to be things like winning the game, fame, money, ego, and external goals. 180 Greek teen basketball players, 144 of which were boys and 36 of which were girls, participated in this study. They filled out the following. They filled out the verbal aggressiveness questionnaire, which was used to assess perceptions of coaches' verbal aggression, and an intrinsic and extrinsic motivation scale, which was used to assess the athlete's overall motivation. The study showed that there was a negative relationship between coaches' verbal aggression and intrinsic motivation, and a positive relationship between coaches' verbal aggression and amotivation. Thus, we see that their verbal aggression by coaches does not lead to improved outcome and actually could be detrimental to athletes and their development, both as an athlete and psychologically. The second piece of literature that we reviewed was the perceived motivational climate's influence on goal orientations, perceived competence, and practice strategies across the athletic season. The purpose of this study was to examine goal orientations, practice strategies, and perceived competence and perceptions of the motivational climate in middle school athletes. They wanted to find out which goal orientation student athletes would adopt during the season, what they thought of the motivational climate, and how the coach also perceived it. It was noted that if the athlete's goal orientation did not match up with the motivational climate, then they showed a decrease over the season. But if they matched, then the athletes showed an increase with their tasks or goal setting. For the groups to reach their potential, you must incorporate effective strategies that promote first developing their skills and refining them before moving on. The next piece of literature we reviewed was pro-social and antisocial behavior in sport, the role of coaching style, autonomous versus controlled motivation, and moral disengagement. The purpose of this study was to examine the relationship between autonomy-supported versus controlled coaching style and motivation to pro-social and antisocial behaviors. What we saw was autonomously motivated athletes enjoy trying to improve through appropriate ways. Controlled motivated athletes were driven by extrinsic rewards or gain, things like money, fame, ego, anything externally. The study itself had 292 athletes participate, 175 male, 114 female, and 3 that were non-reported genders, all from New Zealand, and they completed 4 questionnaires. The results showed that autonomy-supported coaching style led to pro-social behaviors. So, people that did this automatically, so they learned to do this themselves rather than the coach having to push them, had pro-social behaviors, whereas controlled motivational associated with antisocial behaviors, so especially against teammates and opponents. We also saw that controlled motivation led to moral disengagement. The next piece of literature that we reviewed was Fostering Motivation, Understanding the Role Coaches Play in Youth Sport, from the Journal of Physical and Sport Educators. The purpose of this study was to describe how coaches influence motivation and achievement in youth sport, while also showing how specific coaching behaviors can lead to a positive experience. This study examined previous literature on the subject as a foundation for its work. What it found was that today's culture is generally more driven by winning than anything else. There are fewer athletes that are learning that sports can be a fun habit, and not only a fun one, but a healthy habit that they can continue the rest of their lives. So, the studies found that motivation is constantly maintained when there is a high intrinsic motivation. So, the best overall suit for this was not extrinsic motivation, but intrinsic motivation. So, the athlete wanting to do right or the athlete being driven so. The recommendations that the study made was to understand each athlete's motives. So once you understand what drives each athlete, you can properly motivate them. And then emphasize a task mastery orientation. So things like rewarding correct technique and setting realistic expectations for each athlete. And then the final recommendation that it made was use the fun integration theory to increase enjoyment. And overall, it wanted to make sure that these athletes were not only having their needs met as athletes, but their psychological development as well. Coaches must also be more self-aware at the part they play on their youth overall development. The next piece of literature that we reviewed was What Motivates the Motivators, an examination of sport coaches. The purpose of this study was to examine what motivates Australian sport coaches. Coaches' motivation is shown to impact their behavior and influence athlete behavior, performance, and ultimately outcomes. This was done with 13 Australia-based coaches, 9 men and 4 women, with varying competition levels and experience. They were interviewed using a semi-structured format, and the interviews lasted anywhere from 50 to 90 minutes. The reason they used a semi-structured format was to make sure that each coach answered certain questions, but had a little bit of leeway there where if they felt passionate about an area or if they really wanted to elaborate in a certain area. The results showed that there are 4 main reasons why these coaches coached. The first was connection with sport. A lot of them had a deep connection with the sport, usually stemming from somewhere in their youth. The second was the development of the coach and the athletes, so wanting to develop not only themselves but help develop athletes to become better. The third main reason why these coaches coached was external influences, so things like winning, trophies, and reputation. The last was internal influences, so things like enjoyment, passion for sport. And keep in mind that these 4 are not in any particular order. These were just the 4 main reasons that they found. But most coaches aligned with self-determination theory, and most attempted to meet a psychological need or satisfaction. The next piece of literature that we reviewed was Coaches' Motivational Style and Athletes' Fear of Failure. The purpose of this study was to understand what effect would a coaching style have on an athlete's fear of failure. They wanted to focus on measuring fear of failure level, autonomy support from the coach, and controlling style of coach. The data supported the hypothesis that the more controlling the coach, the higher levels of fear of failure. The goal is to be a coach that doesn't control the athlete's fear of failure, but rather guides them and lets them find a more autonomous way to deal with it. So once again, this comes back to finding a way to not externally motivate them to learn to deal with failure, but to find a way to help guide them to internally find a way to deal with it. When picking a coach, you'll have better outcomes for the athlete if you have someone who is more positive than negative. Predicting athletes' functional and dysfunctional emotions, the role of motivational climate and motivational regulations was the next piece of literature that we reviewed. It's important to assess person and task relevant emotion content. Thus, the use of sport-specific measures is recommended. Results showed high scores from the athletes in a task involving climate. There's a higher correlation between task involving climate and showing autonomous behavior, and it was showed that there is a link between an ego involving climate and having a controlling motivation with the coaches. It's proven that in this study that the coach's behaviors can affect the athlete's motivation and emotions. So finally, that brings us to our recommendations. Our first recommendation was don't be controlling. Motivating your staff and department, it should be an autonomous thing. It should be something that you help guide them. You shouldn't have to constantly set negative consequences. You shouldn't have to constantly externally motivate them, although external motivation does help at times. Your goal is to guide your staff to want to do the right thing and to help them to find that path. The next recommendation that we made was don't let your staff you lead be scared of failure, yet motivate them to learn from their failures to make them and the department better. The next recommendation we made was to promote a motivational climate that supports goal setting, autonomy, belief in oneself, and you'll see a growth in your department. So as you start, once again, it comes back to constantly look for an autonomous way to motivate everyone within your staff. And as you start doing this, you are able to take your hands off the reins a little more and more and more, and it creates a staff that wants to do the right thing and wants to do things the right way, rather than you having to force them to do things the right way. The next recommendation we made was take advantage of teaching new skills and letting people refine and perfect those skills rather than just teaching and not giving the time for practice. So we want to constantly reevaluate where we are and our staff is and constantly give them the resources they need to not only refine but attempt to perfect the skills of motivation. And then finally, we want to attempt to foster more intrinsic motivation in athletes and in coaches as well. Every study constantly came back to the fact that intrinsic motivation was significantly more beneficial than extrinsic motivation, especially from a longevity standpoint. So we want to try to foster intrinsic motivation in anything we do. Our conclusion was motivation by coaches not only affects athletic performance, but also psychological development of athletes. So we want to make sure that we understand that we're not only worrying about these athletes and the immediate goals that they have with us, but what we do is developing them and affecting them well beyond the bounds that we'll have. We also saw that verbal aggression by coaches led to less intrinsic motivation and negatively affected overall performance. We found that autonomy supportive coaching styles, as opposed to controlled, led to more positive social behaviors. You also saw that deep intrinsic motivation leads to an overall more positive experience in the athletes themselves, and that coaches are motivated by different things, but most are attempting to fill a psychological need. That was the one thing we kept seeing over and over, aka intrinsic motivation. Coaches need to be more self-aware in their actions was a huge thing. As coaches, we're constantly worried about what our athletes are doing. As administrators, we're constantly worried about what our coaches are doing, but we need to make sure that we have self-awareness. And then finally, know your athletes and coaches. Everyone's different, and it's important to understand them in order to help them reach their peak potential. Here are our references, and thank you.